We've got some stuff to talk about. First and foremost on my mind right now is the US government moving to crush a significant demonstration of workers' power for very modest demands. So let's start at the beginning. What brought on the railroad workers' strike? Railroad workers have been working under awful conditions for many years now. As with most workers, their wages have not kept up with the cost of living, which as we all know has skyrocketed over the past several years, not to mention recent inflation making things worse for them and everyone else. Many of them are on call, which, for those who aren't familiar with this, means that the employer can call an employee into work at any time. The employee has to come in ASAP. In the railway industry, employees end up working long hours due in large part to this particular practice. But most notably, railroad workers are afforded an unconscionable lack of sick days. They are required to use vacation time to cover missed time, which they have to schedule weeks in advance. Obviously, that's not how being sick works. Nobody knows in advance when it's going to happen, how long it's going to last, how severe it's going to be. And oh, by the way, COVID remains an ongoing health issue for which protective measures have largely been stripped away. Just an absolute asinine policy by the industry, which at this point, like all other industries, is under the control of monopoly powers. Understandably fed up, the workers vowed to strike back in September and leverage lost revenue from the strike as a way to move their employer to provide better employment conditions. Before this could ever begin, the White House intervened, recognizing that the loss of revenue for railroad monopolies would be massive. The railroad industry is among the most profitable businesses in the country, not only for the monopolist corporations, but for the banks and other institutions of finance capital that derive huge sums of money off of investment in these companies. Warren Buffett is among the financial elite with significant investments in them. During these initial White House negotiations, the government and the railroad companies brokered a deal with the corrupt leadership in charge of the employees' union, against the wishes of the employees themselves. This government-imposed sellout contract offered only 1 paid and 3 unpaid sick days, among other insulting provisions, and was overwhelmingly opposed by the union's rank and file. Nonetheless, the corrupt union leadership accepted the terms against their members' wishes, and self-proclaimed pro-labor President Biden took a victory lap, claiming his regime averted a major labor conflict while delivering a worker-friendly deal. Too bad for them, the union still had to put the deal to a vote among its members, who largely oppose it. The voting process was incredibly suspect, with many union members reporting they never got their ballots. Many other union members that opposed the deal nonetheless voted to accept it out of a sense of desperation and hopelessness. Despite all this, the workers in the unions involved managed to vote against accepting the contract and are getting ready to strike this month. Panicked, the U.S. government has intervened again, this time taking an unprecedented action by using Congress to force a deal they rejected onto the union workers. In the House, every Democrat voted to impose the deal, joined by a handful of Republicans. House Republicans by and large voted against it, joined by 0 House Democrats, not even self-identified socialist champions of the working class, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Jamal Bowman, Ilhan Omar, or any of them. Not one so-called progressive voted to respect the right of workers to bargain for better employment conditions. In the Senate, the vote was much more bipartisan. A few senators from both sides broke ranks, but this was nothing more than an act of political theater. Among these imposters are Bernie Sanders, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Elizabeth Warren, Kirsten Gillibrand, Jeff Merkley, Tom Cotton, and Josh Hawley. A few of those names are senators with clear presidential aspirations, no doubt seeing this vote as an opportunity to earn the goodwill of working-class voters and establish themselves as politicians who are not really part of the D.C. machine, not like all the others. As for others, such as Bernie and Democrat Jeff Merkley of Oregon, this is an opportunity to maintain their brand as officials who fight for the people. However, this vote was part of an expedited procedure which required the consent of all senators to pass, and there was no question that both houses would pass the resolution. If any of the senators that voted against the resolution sincerely opposed it, they would have denied the expedite. The truth of the matter is, the duopoly does not tolerate real populism. If you fight for the people, these parties and this system will turn all its institutional power against you until you bend the knee. Senator Sanders made a half-hearted attempt to add sick days, offering a resolution that offered a measly 7 of them. It was swiftly voted down. At this point, no doubt many people will ask why neither the industry nor the government are willing to offer even the bare minimum, such as the sick days being sought, given that we know these billion-dollar industries can easily afford it. There are 2 reasons. One is a more psychological principle. The idea that if workers are allowed to get even close to what they bargained for, that they might start to realize their power and start asserting themselves more often and with even greater demands. Second, and more importantly, it's not simply the private profits of the industry that must be protected. It is also the activities of finance capital, i.e. the banks, which not only operate to maximize revenue, but to do so at an impossibly exponential rate. It is not enough merely for them to steadily make money. They must push into astronomical territory, and this irrational system of finance asserts totalitarian control over every aspect of our lives. On that note, we are told that this strike must be crushed with the full force of state power, or it will exact stress on the economy that will hurt working families. Bullshit. The real threat to working families is the relentless drive of monopoly capital and finance capital to take over every industry and use the extraordinary influence that they have accumulated to influence our government to act in their interest. The real threat to working families is the drive of banks and monopolists to drive down working conditions in every industry, drive down living conditions in all walks of life, to deny citizens all recourse with which they can fight to protect their conditions, and then to use state violence against you for daring to speak out about it. And it is precisely for this reason that all working people, all non-working people who are nonetheless fed up with Wall Street, with big capital, with our ruling class, and with the intolerable parasites who shill for them, to stand with the railroad workers in their struggle. As part of the terms of service that this podcast has agreed to, we are not allowed to encourage illegal activity. Our government's actions will likely render any strike by the railroad workers illegal. I'm not allowed to go so far as to say that workers should knowingly break the law and strike anyway. However, I have every right to condemn the acts of our government to make such demonstrations illegal. In so doing, I am reminded of the words of the late President John F. Kennedy, who once famously said, quote, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable." Denying working Americans their basic rights to collectively bargain and to strike is fascistic, anti-free speech, unconstitutional, and thoroughly un-American. I reiterate, everyday Americans of all stripes must stand with the railroad workers in their struggle. Do not be duped by alarmist language of your class enemies, claiming that a strike would cause economic hardship that will hurt families such as your own. A classic case of monopolists and the ruling class pitting people against working people, specifically our society's most productive workers. No industry is safe from banks and from monopoly power using their vast resources to steadily drive down working conditions and living standards across the board. You may not have any personal stake in the railroad employees' contracts, but in this larger conflict, these workers are fighting your enemies. They are fighting Warren Buffett. They are fighting George Soros. They are fighting the very people who are making your life worse in every facet. And that, my friends, is why support for the railroad workers is needed in this critical time.